Well, hi, Stephen.
Hello there.
My first question, who was Sir Tarkin Underspoon?
Oh, well, the first music I made as Porcupine Tree, way back in the late 80s, in fact, early 90s, was kind of a joke. It was kind of an imaginary... Well, actually, I remember getting together with a friend of mine who wasn't a musician, but he was a big music lover, and he had a very big collection of 60s and 70s music. And we used to listen to a lot of that music, psychedelic music, progressive music, space rock, and all the stuff from that era, classic stuff from that era. And we had the idea one day to create a kind of fictional band that could make that kind of music in a kind of nostalgic way. And but except I would play all the instruments, and I'd use a drum machine and overdub all the instruments and the vocals and guitars and keyboards and stuff. And so what we did, the first thing we did, even before a note of music was recorded, was we wrote the history of this fictional band called Porcupine Tree. And we came up with silly names for the various members.
And what kind of bands did you have in mind when you were working on that concept?
Well, actually, the band that kind of inspired the idea was a band called the Dukes of Stratosphere, which was you remember the band XTC? And they had a very similar concept. They had an imaginary psychedelic band called the Dukes of Stratosphere. So we were very inspired by that idea of like a real band creating an imaginary band within the band.
Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band.
Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, exactly, yes, being another great example, yeah. And you know, the kind of bands that we were listening to, and originally I was creating pastiches of these bands as the music. Bands like Gong, Hawkwind, Soft Machine. I remember we did a pastiche of a Soft Machine track. Very obscure bands, because I mean he collected very obscure vinyl releases. I remember a band called Quintessence we were listening to, which is a very obscure late 60s, early 70s British sort of, I don't know how you describe them really. They were kind of they were kind of into all this Buddhism and stuff, and they made kind of weird psychedelic music. So those kind of bands, you know, really underground bands as well.
Yeah. Okay. And then, yeah, this story, I think it pretty much kept going for a few years. Am I right?
When I was just releasing cassettes, like do-it-yourself cassettes, kind of perpetuated the myth of this band. But I think from the point of the first album onwards, the first album was kind of like a collection of the best moments from these cassettes. But after that, I realized that actually there was a great opportunity here to do something very contemporary with a lot of the same inspirations. And actually what became very interesting was taking a lot of those 60s and 70s influences and combining them with what at the time was happening in ambient dub, bands like The Orb and Future Sound of London. And so I made this long 30-minute single called Voyage 34, and that was kind of the first step into doing something more contemporary. And I don't think Porcupine Tree could have existed beyond one album. I mean, it was just a one-off album as a kind of nostalgic joke. Yeah. I think it would have stopped there, you know. Yeah. But at the moment I realised that actually there was potential here to do something quite special and quite contemporary with these influences. That's when the joke kind of stopped, and it became Stephen Wilson trying to create something, you know, a bit more contemporary.
Yeah. Now I was thinking because when I read about you, I had the idea that wasn't the days of the cassettes and the first album a bit of a strange time, that people who came to see you, they read that story, and you know, did they know what to expect?
I don't think they did, because the very first time we played live wasn't until about 4 or 5 years later, after I started the very first cassette. We first played live in December '93, and by then there'd been 2 albums and the Voyage 34 single released. Most of those, all three of those releases, I think, just credited the music and the writing to Porcupine Tree. So I don't think people were quite sure what Porcupine Tree was. Was it a solo artist? Was it a band? Who was in the band? What was the lineup? And that was kind of fun, because people were turning up not really expecting, not knowing what to expect. But by that time, I'd put together a 4-piece band from people I'd worked with and people I knew and people I trusted to play the existing music. But up until that point, all the recording was solo recording. In fact, even after that, it continued to be solo recording for one more record. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.